Hello, my name is Vincent Tovar, Associate Executive Director of MASBA, the Mexican American School Boards Association. This year, we're celebrating our Golden Jubilee, 50 years of closing gaps in our Texas public schools. Thank you for joining us as we present Eligiendo Escuelas, Why Latinx Parents Choose Charter Schools. I am on the edge of my seat here, though standing up, awaiting this powerful presentation. It's truly my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Madeline Mavro Gordato. And I'm committed to honoring her surname. Dr. Mavro Gordato is an associate professor of K-12 Educational Administration and Policy at Michigan State University. Her research investigates how education policies shape outcomes for underserved student populations. She is an expert on educating English learners and immigrant students, as well as developing and evaluating effective school leaders. Her work is informed by her experience serving as a bilingual teacher in Texas and California. She currently serves as a co-editor for the American Educational Research Journal, the flagship journal of the American Educational Research Association. Dr. Mavro Gordato received her PhD in leadership and policy studies from Vanderbilt University. Welcome, Dr. Mavro Gordato.
Vincent, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with y'all today and to have a chance to talk with everybody about a topic that I care so much about. Vincent, I just want to confirm we're good on the audio?
Everything is good. We have a little technical difference today. We have a webcam and audio coming from two different devices for the audience. But thank you all for being here. Thank you, Dr. Mavro Gordato.
Well, great. So I guess we'll go ahead and just jump in. I appreciate Vincent's effort on my last name. I joke with friends who are Spanish speakers and say it's Mavro Gordato, not Mavro Gordito. Gordito, no. So yes, it's a complicated last name. So thank you for honoring it, Vincent. I appreciate that. So as we go ahead and get started today, obviously we're here to talk a little bit about the intersection between Latinx students and school choice. This is a topic that I can speak to just from a couple of different perspectives because I've done research in this area for a number of years, and then I also have experience having taught both in traditional public school settings as well as charter school settings. So just to give you guys a little bit of a sense of my research, and I know some of the text on this slide is a little bit small, but the work that I do really focuses on expanding educational access and equity for underserved student populations, particularly English learners and immigrant students. And so obviously a big chunk of that population in the U.S. Are Latinx students. I come at this from three different angles. I look at the ways that policies are implemented on the ground. So as school board members, y'all know quite well that, for example, the Every Student Succeeds Act looks one way on paper, and then how it plays out in schools and classrooms across the country varies quite substantially. I look at school leadership, the role that school boards, that school districts, that school principals play in expanding or constraining educational opportunity for students. And then I also look at how schools are governed and school choice. And how these types of reforms impact educational opportunity for underserved student groups. So as Vincent said, I have a background as a teacher. So I was a teacher in the Rio Grande Valley. I taught in La Jolla ISD. I was fortunate to have taught there for several years, and fascinatingly, still am very connected in the area, even though I live now on the northern border of the U.S. and I used to live on the southern border. So I'm still in touch with a lot of my students and really well connected with the community there. It's very near and dear to my heart. Texas will always have a big piece of my heart. I also taught in Northern California. And as I mentioned, I have experience teaching both in traditional public school settings and charter settings. So in California, I taught for Aspire Public Schools, which is a large charter management organization that for many years was exclusively located in California, but expanded, maybe 8-9 years ago into Tennessee. Memphis, Tennessee specifically. And so I only taught at Aspire in California. I was not at the Tennessee schools, but you can imagine that these are quite different contexts, both traditional public schools and charter schools to be a teacher in and a teacher working with English learners. But also these were very different contexts in terms of just the area, the socioeconomic status, poverty rate. So when you're talking about the Rio Grande Valley, we're talking about, very, very high rates of poverty. And when we're thinking about Northern California, the San Francisco Bay Area, even though there's poverty in that area, and that poverty has increased due to rising housing costs there in recent years, there's also a tremendous amount of affluence, which means a lot of resources for schools that perhaps might not exist or be as readily accessible in a place like the Rio Grande Valley. So, for example, we had tutors from Stanford University that would come and work with our students after school every day when I taught in Northern California. Very different context. So here's a little bit of an overview of our agenda for today. So I'm going to start out just with a little bit of a background on school choice very briefly. And then we're going to turn to Latinx enrollment in charter schools. We'll just do a scan of the numbers right now. Then we're going to talk a little bit about some research that I have done that looks specifically at why Latinx families choose charter schools for their kids. And then we're also going to think a little bit about how traditional public school districts can respond. All right. So when we think about school choice, I think one of the things that's really important to think about and remember is that obviously school choice has become a very prominent and popular school reform strategy when it comes to efforts to improve schools, particularly urban schools. And so when you think about the way that school choice is often positioned by the current administration, and as it has been actually by a number of administrations, this is a quote from President Trump that he said while he was on the campaign trail in 2016. He said, "Every single inner city child in America who is today trapped in a failing school should have the freedom, the civil right to attend the school of their choice." And so this is interesting, right? Because in essence, the way that school choice is being framed is that this is a civil right for students. And this is sort of an interesting way of thinking about this. And I think one of the reasons why this has become such a popular education reform strategy, because people are linking having choices about education to civil rights. And so it's something that a lot of people have gotten behind, and this has experienced bipartisan support. So let's talk briefly about immigration just as an urban phenomenon. So I thought it would be helpful just to show this map, because obviously one of the things that's really important to think about when we think about school choice, so often charter schools particularly locate in urban areas. And when we think about the intersection between immigration and then where charter schools are locating, obviously there's a big overlap there. So often it's major metropolitan areas where charter schools locate, and it's major metropolitan areas where immigrant communities settle. And so big overlap there. So obviously you can see this intersection, right, in terms of how charter schools may be impacting Latinx families. So when we look at some of the sort of, quote, geography of charters, charter schools are overwhelmingly located in urban areas where Latinx families often settle. And interestingly, when we look at the top 4 states in terms of the number of charter schools that they have, the top 4 states are Arizona, California, Florida, and Texas. And these 4 states alone account for 2,900 of the 6,800 charter schools nationwide. And when I look at those 4 states, one of the things that I think about right off the bat is that those 4 states have very high Latinx populations in them as well. So charter schools are locating in states where there are high Latinx populations and in urban areas within states where there are high Latinx populations. And then if you see this map on the right, what this shows you, these are districts with greater than 260 English learner students. So this is just a map that I created using some geographic information system software. But what you can see is that in larger school districts and larger metropolitan areas, this is where charter schools locate overwhelmingly. So this is just a map of Texas, but obviously we see this play out across the country in a similar way. So one of the things that's important to remember is that it really remains unclear whether school choice reform will expand educational access and equity for Latinx students whose families often face linguistic, cultural, and economic barriers. So given that school choice has emerged as a linchpin of the Trump administration's urban education reform plans, it's really important for us to gauge whether school choice actually has the potential to expand or constrain educational opportunities for these students, and understand better why Latinx parents are choosing charter schools, particularly if we don't know if charter schools are doing a better job of serving these students. So given that I'm a professor, I had to bring a little bit of theory into our presentation. So don't worry, I'm not going to bombard you here, but I did think it made sense for us just to take a quick look at the main theory that underpins the school choice reform effort in the U.S. So this is just a quick crash course on market theory. So one of the things that is important to just look at is why school choice is expanded and sort of what the logic is behind why we should have school choice in our public education system, right? So there are two scholars, John Chubb and Terry Moe, who published a book called Politics, Markets, and America's Schools a number of years ago, and this book sort of became the Bible or the backbone of the modern school choice movement, particularly the charter school movement. So a couple of important quotes. One says, schools compete for the support of parents and students are free to choose among schools. So again, this notion of competition here is very important when we think about the logic behind charter schools. If schools have to compete, market theory says schools will improve because they will have to work harder to keep students or to get students to begin with. Another important quote, an educational market allows for the emergence of new and different types of schools so that people really have an attractive and dynamically responsive set of alternatives from which to choose. And one of the things that's important in this quote is this idea of innovation that is sort of embedded here, right? So if there's competition, then schools will perhaps have new or different academic programs that they might offer. That might be innovative and might do a better job of meeting students' needs. And then finally, one other quote that's important for us just to take a quick look at. Schools need to ensure that they are providing the kinds of services parents and students want, and that they have the capacity to cater and adjust to their clients' specialized needs and interests. And I think one of the important ideas here to elevate is that students and parents are being cast as clients, right? And that these clients are customers or consumers, these are other words you often hear in place of client, that they have different needs, and that school choice will better position schools to meet those diverse needs of families and students. Now, I just want to be very clear as I'm talking here, that this is what market theory suggests, okay? This is not me saying this is what I believe. This is what market theory and market theorists such as John Chubb and Terry Moe suggest underpin the school choice movement. But I think we could pull some of these ideas apart a little bit, because I think market theory does in fact break down in terms of some of the key assumptions that are embedded in market theory that perhaps are not safe to assume. So assumption number one that I think is important for us to think about is that parents will choose schools that are high quality, and high quality is defined as high performing academically. So this idea is that parents will actually be able to distinguish between high quality, academic, highly performing, academically oriented schools versus schools that are lower performing. And market theory assumes that parents can do that, and that parents have access to the information they need to distinguish between high and low quality schools. And that's often not the case. One of the things that the research literature has shown us is that it's actually quite difficult to gauge whether schools are high or low performing. Even when you look at complex data systems, We've had a lot more data in the past 10 to 15 years come out because of federal requirements under No Child Left Behind and the Every Student Succeeds Act. But that doesn't mean that this data is accessible to families and that they know how to understand and interpret that data. Another assumption that's embedded in market theory that I think I would argue breaks down is this idea that parents will be active consumers in the educational marketplace and that they will shop around. So they will take time to learn about schools, weigh options, and make an informed decision. And again, this is just not something that we necessarily see take place. Sometimes parents really are not in a position where they can shop around. They don't have time to look at 10 different schools and think about which one of these best meets my student's needs. A lot of times they might make a decision to look at a school or to enroll their child in a school based on something that has nothing to do with academic performance of that school. It could be as simple as, this is a charter school that has a brand new building and it's bright and shiny, and I equate a brand new building with a high quality education, so I'm going to enroll my child there. But these are just some of the issues that arise when we think about market theory. Okay, so I'm done with the theory side of things, but thanks for indulging me as a professor. I felt like I needed to talk through a little bit of that for a minute. But then let's take a minute and let's just think about perhaps, how school choice, there may be barriers that occur when it comes to school choice for Latinx families specifically. So I want to talk about two sets of barriers. The first set, these are student or family-driven barriers. And so these are barriers that I think you could argue are specific to Latinx families, particularly newer Latinx families. So for example, this picture on the top left with the two heads and the talking to one another, but everything being jumbled in the little talking bubble. And the idea here is that language can actually be a major barrier for our Latinx families, again, particularly for newer immigrant Latinx families, where the idea of shopping around and gathering information on different schools really may not be possible for a lot of our Latinx parents. Looking at data systems, talking to gather perspectives from parents who have kids at the school, this may be a real barrier for a number of our parents. Another barrier that I think is important to mention has to do with cultural familiarity and literacy and navigability around this notion of shopping around. So for many of our Latinx families, again, particularly newer immigrant families, first-gen families, for example, it can be really challenging to understand just even this notion that there are choices in a public school system that do not cost money, because most of our families are coming from countries where there is no idea, there is no remote notion of being able to choose a school other than a traditional public school that your kid is zoned to go to that doesn't cost you money. So this whole idea of a charter school, which charters do not cost money, there's no tuition or fees, right, with charter schools. But this idea may just be very foreign to a lot of our parents. And so this idea of engaging in a system of public school choice, that may be an obstacle as well. And then finally, this map, which I know may be very small, but what this map shows you, this is the city of Houston, and this just shows you race and ethnicity in terms of where different groups of people settle around the city. And so, for example, the yellower parts of that map are Latinx families and communities. The blue sections are white families. The green sections are Black African-American families. And then the red sections are Asian families. And I think the key here with what I'm trying to illustrate is that segregation in terms of where people live is a big issue. And so when we think about how segregation intersects with school choice, it may be the case that immigrant families who live in segregated communities don't have the same opportunities in terms of having high quality schools to choose from that are close to them, even if they have choices, right, in their schools. But it also may mean that their information is very constrained because of a reliance on social networks around them to learn about school options. And so this is one of the concerns we have when we look at residential segregation and school choice. So I also just wanted to talk through a couple of barriers that have surfaced in the research literature that have to do with school-driven barriers, right? So these are things that schools may or may not be doing, charter schools may or may not be doing, that can pose barriers for Latinx families. So one thing, obviously, is this idea that marketing, where charter schools market, how they market, to whom they market, that this can shape the students who show up to enroll, right? And so if charter schools are marketing to a specific audience and they are not marketing toward Latinx families or in Latinx communities, then the likelihood of Latinx families showing up is lower, right? And so charter schools make decisions about how they advertise and to whom and where, and these shape the students that ultimately end up in the schools. Another issue obviously just has to do with where charter schools locate. The location of a school is extremely critical in terms of who shows up at that school. So if you as a charter school are not interested in serving Latinx students, you're probably not going to locate in a neighborhood or in a community that has a high Latinx population. And so charter schools can in essence game the system by choosing where they locate, right? That's going to shape who shows up in their school. And then finally, there has been some really interesting work done recently by a couple of scholars who have looked at differences in how charter schools respond to inquiries from parents. And so what these scholars did was they posed as parents and they sent charter schools emails, and they, in essence, cast themselves as different types of parents. So, for example, sometimes they signed emails with Hispanic surnames, right? Sometimes they wrote the emails in Spanish. Sometimes they indicated in the email that they had a child with special educational needs, and all they were doing was inquiring for more information from the charter school. And what they found, this was an experiment that they ran, and what they found was that parents with Spanish surnames were less likely to get a response from the charter school than parents who did not have Spanish surnames, right? And then they also found that parents who indicated that their children had some type of special educational need also were less likely to get a response from the charter school with more information about enrolling their child. So these are practices, right, that charter schools are employing to perhaps shape the student population that they are serving. So just despite the barriers that Latinx families face when it comes to engaging in a system of school choice, it is interesting to note that Latinx families do appear to be enrolling in charter schools at increasing rates. And so when you just look at this graphic, you can see this is a comparison between 2004 and 2016. So this is the growth of Hispanic enrollment in district and charter public schools, right? So orange bars are traditional public school districts, and blue bars are charter schools. So what you can see is that the growth rate has been higher for Latinx students in charter schools than it has been in traditional public schools. So we went from 19 to 25% in traditional public school districts and 21 to 30% in charter schools. And so this does suggest that Latinx families are enrolling in charter schools at increasing rates. We also actually see some statistics that have shown us that in several states, there are high English learner enrollment in charter schools. And obviously that intersects quite closely with the Latinx population, since the vast majority of English learners in the US are Latinx students. So for example, in the state of Texas, 15.3% of non-charter school students were English learners, whereas 19.4% of charter school students were English learners. So what this looks like is it looks like English learners are actually overrepresented in charter schools in the state of Texas, which theory would suggest it would be harder for these populations to participate in a system of school choice due to the barriers that they face. But what we're seeing here is that it looks like in certain contexts, there are schools that are actively working to enroll and attract the Latinx population. However, it is important to note that there is a really important distinction to be made between state level aggregates and then looking more at a local level, such as an individual school district. So we have to factor in when we're thinking about these over and under representation conversations. For example, this picture in Texas here, right, looking like ELs are overrepresented in charter schools. We have to think about the fact that charter schools are not evenly distributed across the state of Texas or any other state for that matter. And we also have to remember that Latinx families are not evenly distributed either. That it tends to be that charter schools are located primarily in dense urban and metropolitan areas, as well as Latinx families tend to be clustered in these areas as well. So when you aggregate those numbers up to the state level, oftentimes it looks like English learners or Latinx families are over-enrolled or over-represented in charters, but when you break it down and look at districts, they in fact are underrepresented in a number of districts that have higher EL and higher Latinx populations. So let me just illustrate this concept for you guys just a little bit more clearly. Hopefully some of these illustrations will help with this. So one thing here to note, so this is just a graphic that I put together, right? This is not obviously an actual school district, but the green square is meant to represent a school district. And within the boundaries of this school district, we're just looking at two schools that are within the boundaries of this school district. One is a traditional public school, the dark green dot, and then the other is a charter school, the gray dot. And then the size of the circle represents whether there's low Latinx representation in the school or high Latinx representation. So what it looks like here, since both of these circles are smaller, is that there is equal representation between the traditional public school and the charter school that are located in the same geographic district. So we might say here it looks like they're evenly or equally represented across both traditional public and charter schools. And then here's an example where there's higher Latinx representation in the charter school. So if we look at this second district, it makes it look like Latinx students are overrepresented in the charter school compared to their traditional public school counterpart located in the same geographic area, right? So we may say, this may prompt us to say, hey, there's a problem here, there's something going on. Why are Latinx students overrepresented in the charter school? But it's really important that we factor in not just looking at the numbers of kids in the school, but we have to look at the population around the school, because we know that where a school is located matters so much in terms of which kids show up there. So what I've done here is now I've added another layer of information onto this graph, right? So you can see 1A and 1B. So these are the same school districts, but I've just added more information, right? So when you look at 1B, for example, it turns out that the charter school that is represented in this geographic area is in an area with many Latinx students, whereas the traditional public school that is represented here happens to be in an area that has a lower Latinx population around it. So when we layer on this information, we might actually draw a very different conclusion, right? We might say, look, Latinx students are actually way underrepresented in the charter school in District 1, because it looks like this population, they should be enrolling many, many more Latinx students, because that's what the community looks like around the school, okay? And then you can see the sort of opposite story in 2B, where with District 2, we may actually say, look, English learners are appropriately represented, Latinx students. Latinx students are appropriately represented in the charter school in District 2, because that charter school is located in a neighborhood where there are many Latinx families living. Okay, so you really have to factor in these local level demographics in order to understand this issue of over or underrepresentation. I get real wary with these broad state comparisons. So just to give you guys an actual example, in the state of New York, when they've done work that looks at English learners specifically, and English learners appear to be overrepresented in charter schools at the state level, right? When you aggregate up to the state level. But when you actually look at representation of English learners in New York City public schools, which is obviously the largest school district in the state of New York, the largest school district period, but the largest school district in the state of New York as well, they are well underrepresented in charter schools. So you can see here that there is quite a substantial gap, approximately 10 to 15% at every grade level in terms of representation. Okay. So let me pause there for a second. Vincent, let me just ask you if it would be appropriate if I should just keep moving, or if we should stop and take a couple of questions before we dive into why Latinx families choose charter schools.
I think that a couple of questions. Well, I've had people saying that they wanted to share questions. I know one trustee here in Austin had a comment, but I don't see them popping up. I encourage anybody to, share a question or type something in the chat box there on your panel at any time. I had a question about tracking, and when it comes to tracking, why parents, and maybe you might get to this later on in the presentation, but if there are districts that track and document why parents are enrolling their kids in their schools or why they're withdrawing. For example, they're enrolling their kid in the school because it has STEAM or because it has after school program, or they're withdrawing, or they're withdrawing their kid because housing or because they're moving. And so if they're moving, are they moving because of housing, or are they moving because of a new job, or are they withdrawing because they're going to a charter school? And if they're going to a charter school, which one and why? Is there any kind of district that's doing that right now?
Offhand, I know that there are districts that do this, but I don't think it's a practice that we tend to see often implemented. It's actually one of the suggestions that I have toward the end of the presentation is to implement a routine exit interview with parents or families that are unenrolling children. And just to understand, because a lot of times those parents will come by a school office to collect some records or indicate that they're not going to be back or whatever it may be, and just to snag that parent and in 2 to 3 minutes have 3 or 4 questions and just say, where are you going? And if it's a local school that they're going to, that's a charter school, for example, to ask, what is it that prompted you to choose that school instead of staying within the traditional public school district?
I know we had a question if there'll be a copy of the presentation available, and this presentation is being recorded. And when we send out the certificates for folks who are attending, we can send out the recording as well, or a link to the recording. I believe I might be getting another question here. Let's see. No, I think we're good to go. If you want to continue.
Okay, sounds great. All right, so let's go ahead then and turn to this topic of Latinx families and charter schools specifically, and digging into this idea of what motivates Latinx parents to consider a charter school, and then what informs Latinx parents' decisions to actually enroll their child in a charter school. So these sound like similar questions, but they're a little bit different. So hopefully these illustrations help get the point across about why they're different. So the first step when we're thinking about school choice always have to do with dipping a toe in the water. And before you dip a toe in the water, you have to be interested in wanting to go up to the pool and dip your toe in the water, right? There's something that prompts you to think about dipping your toe in the water. So this is this idea of what motivates families to actually consider a charter school to begin with, right? And then the second question is what informs parents' decisions to actually enroll their child in a charter school? So to me, this is the equivalent of what prompts families to dive in, right? So there's what motivates you, and then what prompts you to actually make the decision to enroll in a school. So just to flesh this idea out, there's a pretty standard school choice process that occurs that families tend to employ across the board, whether we're looking at Latinx families or other families when they're engaging in the school choice process. As we go through, I'm going to talk through how Latinx families are thinking about this. But first, I just wanted to present sort of this overarching what we tend to see if you break the school choice process down into components. So the first is families make a decision to consider a charter school, right? So this is this notion of dipping a toe into the water, right? Then families typically investigate the choices that they have in charter schools, and they go through a process of narrowing their choice set. So it may be that they know of 5 schools that they would consider, and they go through a process of gathering a little bit of information to see which schools they're going to leave on the list, and then which schools they're going to take off the list. So they narrow their choice set, they gather information about specific schools, they visit the finalist schools. Typically that is a big thing families do, is they visit a couple, 1 or 2 schools that they are really considering as finalists for their kids. And then after that, they make a decision and actually enroll their child. So at each of these different points, there's sort of a different thought process that occurs. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So we're going to start here with this idea of dipping a toe in the water. And Latinx parents, what prompts them to decide to consider a charter school? So there are really 2 factors that come into play here. One is push factors. So these are negative perceptions of traditional public schools, either through firsthand experience or appropriated from people within their network. So they're talking to friends, and their friends are saying lots of negative things about the traditional public schools, and then that colors this parent's perception, even if they don't have direct experience with the traditional public schools. And so here's an example of a quote from a parent, and these are actual quotes that have come out of a research study that I have conducted, where we surveyed over 2,000 parents who had chosen to attend a charter school or chosen for their child to attend a charter school. And we interviewed about 30 parents, including half of whom were Latinx parents. And we conducted those interviews in Spanish as well with parents. And so these are actual quotes from parents from the research study that we conducted. But so one parent said, truthfully, my siblings did not recommend a public school because they practically don't teach the kids anything, or that they don't teach them that much. So again, you can see that even though this is a parent of a kindergarten student, and she was reflecting on just this idea of like, she had already heard enough and had a negative perception of the traditional public schools before she even got her kid into a traditional public school. And so her siblings shaped the way she was thinking about traditional public schools and prompted her to look for an alternative for her child before even enrolling in a traditional public school to begin with. There are also pull factors. So sometimes what prompts parents to consider a charter school is the belief that a charter school will offer something above and beyond what the traditional public school does. So here's an example of a quote from a father who said he was interested in a charter school because of the way that students are disciplined. Besides this, there are fewer children in the class, and the fewer children in the class, the more children learn. And so again, this was this idea of the charter school based on the perceptions that he had and based on what he had heard, did a better job with student discipline, which was a value for this parent. And he wanted smaller class sizes. And he saw these things as something that the charter school offered above and beyond what the traditional public school offered. So these were the factors that pulled him to consider a charter school over a traditional public school. So then let's turn to narrowing the choice set a little bit. So, what do parents do when they say, okay, I need to find an alternative for my kid, and then they're going to look around and they're going to say, well, what are my choices? And then they're going to think through the process of narrowing those choice sets. So here's an example of a parent who says there was a very long list of charter schools. We were given the list and we looked for the ones that were closest to us, and then which happened to be 2 or 3 of them. So for this parent, you can hear in narrowing the choice set that proximity to home matters a lot to this parent. So that's how they started, with a whole list of charter schools that were located within their geographic area, and they narrowed that list based on where those charter schools were located relative to their home. Another parent here talked about a specific value that this parent had. And so this parent was really interested in uniforms, because this parent saw uniforms as an indicator of a high-quality education, sort of like what a kid might get in a private school, right? So these are sort of symbols of high-quality education. It doesn't mean that there's actually high-quality education happening, but these are symbols that parents often associate with high-quality education. So this parent said, I like the fact that a lot of charter schools, they wear uniforms, just a personal preference. So I looked for the charters where students wore uniforms. So this is how this parent narrowed their list, right? I think sometimes we think that parents are think very deeply and in a complex way about how they're narrowing their list and how they're thinking about charter schools, and that they're making these decisions based on data or academics. But what we see in the research that we've done is that oftentimes parents make these decisions that are very important decisions for their children in ways that we might be surprised by, right? Those of us who work in traditional public school districts, because, for example, picking a school based on whether or not a school has uniforms, I think those of us who study education, know education well, know that that does not necessarily mean a higher quality education. But for a parent who is less familiar with the system, if what they have grown up with is seeing kids around them wear uniforms who were attending private schools, for example, if the parent, grew up somewhere where that was the phenomenon happening, then they may say there's a better quality education happening here because kids wear uniforms. It's sort of a correlation, right, that they make. How do parents gather information about schools? So there are a number of ways that they do this, but one of the things that is particularly prominent among the Latinx population has to do with social networks. So word of mouth is really, really important in the Latinx population. And so here are two quotes from parents that sort of illustrate this idea. So one parent says, I knew a woman who has her children there, meaning at a charter school, and she commented to me about the school. And because of that, she told me that it was a very good school, that they are doing well, and because of this, I took a closer look at the school. And another parent said, my friend has a son. She's a single mom just like myself. And everything she said was pretty nice about it, meaning the charter school. And her son was already attending there for about 2 years, and she was pretty pleased. So you can see here that friends, particularly friends who share a similar characteristic, like single mom to single mom, these perspectives really matter. And when we compared interviews from Latinx parents to, for example, white and Black families, what we found was that in the Latinx population, hearing from friends and family that a charter school was good was really important in the Latinx community. So this word of mouth piece is absolutely essential and definitely more important, it appears, based on the research, than data, right, that we might be pulling on school performance. Because it has to do with perceptions of people in your network. You're going to rely on them more than you are school performance data. Visiting the finalists, what matters in this process? So it's pretty typical that when parents are thinking really carefully about a charter school, that they will go visit that school. And so part of what makes parents make the decision is how they feel when they go visit the school. They want to know if that school is going to be a good place, a nice place for their child. So you can see in these quotes, from the time one enters into a place, you know if it's good. You can feel if it is good or bad, right? So this is a parent saying initial impressions walking into the school really mattered. Is this a warm, welcoming, caring environment, or is it chaotic? Are there teachers yelling at kids? Are kids sitting in straight lines, silent up against a wall waiting for the bus? These are the kinds of things that really matter when parents come in and get a first impression about a place. And here's another quote. Yes, there are also bilingual teachers, and in the office area, they always have someone who speaks Spanish. There aren't communication problems there because they have people who speak Spanish also. In case someone doesn't understand something, they are there to help, to assist. And so this was a parent who was reflecting on the fact that there was somebody who spoke her language at the school, at the charter school, was absolutely critical when she went and visited. And that left a lasting impression, because this was a big difference between, for this parent, between the charter school and her sense of feeling welcome and like she could communicate easily with teachers and staff about her child, versus the traditional public school that her child was enrolled in, where when she went into the main office, there was nobody who spoke her language, and she didn't feel very welcome in the office. And so these people who parents interact with, our front office staff, our school lobbies, these spaces and these people are absolutely important in making these impressions with parents, because parents just don't spend as much time in the rest of the school and in classrooms to see whether there's high quality teaching and instruction happening. A lot of times they base their opinion on a school based on some of these symbolic types of things, right? What does the lobby look like? How do I feel when I come into the school? And these things are important because they do color people's opinions. So after this process, obviously parents then aggregate the information that they've collected along the way, and ultimately they make a decision to enroll. So just to elevate a couple of key points here, as we sort of get ready to wrap up, how do Latinx and non-Latinx parents differ in terms of how they engage in school choice? So one of the things that our research has shown us is that these different groups of parents possess similar motivations and have the same general choice process. But as I mentioned a second ago, Latinx parents rely much more heavily on social networks than formal information sources, such as school performance data or internet searches, to inform their choice. So this is really critical, figuring out how to get into networks, social networks, to share information with parents about a traditional public school district doing good things for students is going to really be important to keep students in traditional public schools instead of charters. Another thing that was really, really important for Latinx parents had to do with bilingual staff, particularly bilingual staff when they came into the building, or bilingual staff who could be readily accessed. Like, we interviewed another parent who said they didn't have a secretary who was bilingual in the office, but they had several teachers who were bilingual, and they would just call one of those teachers who would come down to the office when I was there, and they always had somebody who could help me understand and made me feel welcome. And so this is a big issue too for Latinx families. Do they feel like they have somebody in the office or who's close by who they can connect with when they come into the school? So how can traditional public school districts respond? So I have 3 ideas that I wanted to share with you guys today just as we wrap up. So one is to focus on relationships and social networks. So how can traditional public school districts think about this? So one thing is to make sure that schools that serve Latinx families have a warm, welcoming, and bilingual front office staff person, and just a warm, welcoming front school lobby office space. I'm sure that you guys have been into different schools as school board members. Some schools you walk in and they just exude warmth, right? Where everybody feels welcome. You see kids smiling, you see parents chatting and mingling as they may be waiting for a kid. Other places you walk in, they're cold, they're chilling, and you just don't get that warm vibe. And these things really matter in shaping parents' perceptions about the broader school, even though it's just the front piece of the school that they interact with. So how do you go about, getting into these networks? So one thing is to really work on building close relationships with Latinx families, to host events in your schools and in your districts that bring Latinx parents into the building and help them feel connected with the traditional public schools. Another thing to do is to build connections with community institutions that serve Latinx families. So, for example, the traditional public school district could partner with a community organization on an event or something, right? Because the idea is, again, if you can get into these social networks that parents are relying on so heavily, Latinx parents rely on so heavily when they're thinking about a charter school, then instead of parents talking about how great the charter school is, parents are going to be sharing within their social networks how great the traditional public schools are. So getting into these social networks is going to be really important. The second idea on how traditional public school districts can respond to Latinx parents leaving traditional public schools and choosing charters is to focus on transitions in school. So natural transitions between schools, meaning, for example, going from elementary to middle or middle to high school, these tend to be the points at which the pipe is the leakiest, meaning we lose more kids out of traditional public schools to charters during those transition points. And so figuring out how to keep parents and families connected as you're approaching those transition points is going to be really, really important, right? So we know that resources are constrained. So if you want to focus somewhere, focus on those transition years. So one thing to think about is to offer school transition programming for students and parents between pre-K to K, elementary and middle and high school. So for example, this summer, if those kinds of things have been disrupted, then figuring out how to get this information to parents, with this pandemic going on, and help parents and families stay connected will be important. So there's a possibility of webinars, sending information to parents in the mail, but just continuing to be connected with parents, particularly parents of kids who are in transition years. And then one other idea is to really focus in on your specific context. So I think it's so important to gather a little bit of information on the charters in your area to see what it is that makes them attractive to Latinx families in your district. So as I mentioned, sort of in the middle of the presentation today, when Vincent was asking the question, gathering some data on push and pull factors in your district through something like an exit interview survey could be something very simple that just allows you to collect some data, right? Why are parents leaving? Why are they going somewhere else? Are they leaving the district altogether, or are they going to a charter school? And if they're choosing a charter school, what was it that prompted them to choose that charter school? Another thing to do is to really look carefully at your district's program offerings and compare them to local charter schools, and to ask if perhaps magnet programs or some other type of academic program is a possibility if a charter school is offering something along those lines and your district is not. So one of the best examples I have seen of this, and in Texas especially, a lot of the charter management organizations such as IDEA, public schools, Yes Prep, KIPP, they focus on this college preparatory approach, right? No excuses, college for certain approach, and that has really lured a lot of families that want their kids to go to college into charter schools. And one of the ways that a number of the traditional public school districts have responded is by then implementing early college programs in high school. And I have seen kids leave the charter schools that they had gone to because of their college preparatory focus and come back into the traditional public schools because of early college programs that promise dual enrollment and opportunities to earn credit. So these are just a couple of different ideas. One other thing just to keep in mind is, and I couldn't help but mention COVID-19 in this presentation. I know we're just so overwhelmed by this stuff. But I think right now, a lot of districts are concerned about losing students to charters, particularly virtual charters, in light of the pandemic, and for good reason, right? And so I just think it is so critical for school districts to figure out how to stay in touch with families through mail, through webinars, through summer school that might be happening online, whatever type of engagement traditional public school districts can continue to have with Latinx families during the summer to make sure that those families come back in the fall. So I'm going to stop there and turn to questions and comments. I really appreciate everybody's time.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Mavro Gordato. That was a ton of helpful information, and I couldn't be more pleased and grateful. So thank you. We did get a comment and a question. I know we're low on time here, but definitely want to make sure you had time. Comment is that, school privatization, quote unquote, is a more accurate term than school choice when talking about charters. School choice existed far before charters entered the scene. Privately run charters deplete funds and actually limit the offerings and choices of traditional public school students, where the vast majority of Texas students attend. For those who agree, please refer to charters as what they provide. School privatization, not school choice. And that was from one of our own Austin Independent School District trustees, R.T. Singh. So that was a comment. And then a question, let's see here as I'm searching. The graduation rates that we're noticing, I'm curious about the graduation rates of charter schools from higher education. What is the graduation rates of Latinx from charter schools, the Latinx population from charter schools who actually graduate from college? Many charter schools are able to get students accepted to four-year schools, but these students do not graduate from them. And that is from our own AISD, Austin ISD, Dr. Sanford James, Health Academy Director at Eastside Memorial High School.
So let me respond just to the first comment about school privatization. I agree. I think we could call this a number of different things. I think researchers tend to call these ecosystems of school choice because the way that parents think about these things is they just think about them as choices, and they don't think about them as public-private. They just say, okay, I can choose a school and it's not costing me money, right? And so that's, I think, the reason I use the language I use, but I completely agree. You could call it school privatization as well. Absolutely. The second question about graduation rates. So this is a big concern, particularly for the charter management organizations that are these college prep programs, right? The idea academies, the Yes Prep, KIPP, that are so college driven and focused. They are not getting the same number of kids through college as they are getting them into college, right? So this is a big concern, and I know that some of these charter management organizations have actually begun to think about trying to continue to support their graduates as they go into college. And so these are conversations that they are having because they realize it's a big disconnect, right? Getting into college is not the same as graduating from college. However, in the same breath, I have to also mention that this is one of the big problems that is emerging with early college high schools that are traditional public schools, that a lot of these schools are getting kids into college, but we're actually seeing higher rates of 2-year college and lower rates of 4-year college for kids who are going from early college into a post-secondary institution. So this is sort of a problem that we're grappling with in different ways, how to get our kids through college who have been prepared for college.
And I noticed you mentioned magnet programs, and I wanted to share, what I thought those could also be forms of segregation, and creating opportunity gaps. And my daughter actually just is finishing her last year this year in a magnet middle school. So we've seen that firsthand, and she's going to go to an early college high school next year where Dr. James is teaching. So I do, want to mention that, but school districts could be innovative and in the last piece, create some kind of opportunity for traditional public school students to attend their traditional public schools virtually or online if they don't feel comfortable being, indoors or with other students, at least for a significant amount of time. But yeah, did you have any closing words, Dr. Mavro-Gordato?
I guess that I can just say a couple of things. One is this is very complex, right? This is a very complex issue, and there are layers of complexity because there are these broad pictures, but then how things are playing out at local levels vary tremendously, right? And so understanding, obviously, your local context is going to be really valuable in terms of considering how to respond, right? So, for example, where I live here in Michigan, more than 80% of the charter schools that we have in the state of Michigan are for-profit institutions, which in many states is actually illegal, right? And it is something that I am vehemently against just from a personal, moral, and ethical perspective. And so our context is different, right, in terms of how we're thinking about charter schools than in a place like Texas. And so I think just really understanding the context, it matters in terms of your response, right? That's one thing. Second thing is my email is here, my email address. I'm on Twitter as well. Please don't hesitate to reach out. I'd love to have one-on-one conversations with people who are interested in some more information or just want to talk more at a local level about thinking about how to respond in this area. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me. It's really lovely to have an opportunity to connect with all of you today.
I cannot thank you enough. I mean that from my heart. Thank you so much. I do apologize though for not having a formal evaluation today for you, but all of our audience members can give their feedback by responding to the email that they're going to get, immediately thanking them for attending today. So if you're out there and you want to respond with any feedback, we can send that. We can take that and also take that to Dr. Mavro-Gordato. Thank you so much. Our next webinar will be at noon on Tuesday, May 26th. April Lee Hernandez will be speaking on understanding the dynamics of intimate partner violence. April has been in numerous movie and television productions and is arguably most famous for her role as Eva in the 2007 film on a true story, based on a true story, Freedom Riders. That's right, I'm getting choked up. Freedom Riders is going from charter, Dr. Mavro Gordato to Freedom Riders. Like it's so exciting, I'm getting choked up here. Fortunately, you have time to watch Freedom Riders on Netflix before then. So please spread the word and join us next Tuesday, May 26th at noon. Thank you, Dr. Mavro Gordato. Also, thank you, Dr. Hudia Jabbar at our own UT for connecting us. University of Texas at Austin, and all of our viewers, have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.